Welcome to Cooking Maryland's Way, a series of videos highlighting recipes from Maryland's Way, the Hammond-Harwood House Cookbook. My name is Joyce White. I'm a food historian and trustee of Hammond-Harwood House, and I'm delighted to bring you this tasty food history series. This episode's recipe is for Mr. Bordley's Christmas Pie and is attributed to Mr. J.B. Bordley. The recipe is contained in the Lloyd family papers held in the library of the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore. Mr. Bordley described the pie as being similar to the Yorkshire Christmas Pie recipe found, quote, in Glass's book. Hannah Glass was a well-known cookbook writer in 18th century England and America. Bordley said that Glass's pie was, quote, much like what used to be in my family, but the cook is dead who made them, so that the method she used is lost. That's a helpful reminder to record your recipes. This is an illustration of a Yorkshire Christmas pie served to Queen Victoria and the royal family at Windsor Castle in 1858. Before this impressive pie can be explained, we do need to look back at the history of pies to put it in perspective. The earliest pies were often referred to as coffins because the pastry, often just coarsely ground flour and hot water, was used as a means in which to cook the contents. It was basically a disposable pie tin. Removable pastry lids were also made and affixed to the tops of the coffin bottoms, hence their similarity to coffins. When served, the lids were removed and the contents scooped out. The pastry was either used again for a new pie or fed to the poor or the pigs. The first known English recipe containing pie crusts actually meant to be eaten, not just used as cooking vessels, is called To Make a Cover Tart After the French Fashion, and comes from A Proper New Book of Cookery, published in 1545 in Tudor England. From then on, both types of pies were made, those with pastry meant to be consumed, and those with pastry meant to be used just as coffins or cooking vessels. To support a freestanding raised pie, the dough needed to be very strong and thick, therefore they weren't always desirable to eat, but sometimes they could be made more palatable. This recipe for raised pies from Eliza Acton's 1845 cookbook, Modern Cookery in All Its Branches, illustrates this point perfectly. It gives the cook the choice to make a tender, delicious pastry or a tough, inedible pastry. In the early days, these pies were raised by hand with no tools or molds. The pie was assembled from various pastry pieces, a circle for the bottom, a rectangular panel for the sides, and another circle for the lid, plus decorations for the top. One tool that emerged to help form pies of identical size was the wooden pie dolly. These pie forms were used to create small individual-sized pies. Eventually, by the late 18th century, raised pie molds started to be made with metals such as tin and copper. This is an advertisement from 1793 for raised pie molds being auctioned off at Dunstan Park Estate in Thatcham in Berkshire, England. This is a very early American advertisement for pie molds that appeared in 1803 in the Aurora General Advertiser from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Over the course of the 19th century, a variety of metal pie mold styles were available. Basket motifs were very popular. The molds also sported fluted designs or were adorned with fruits, vines, or chevron patterns, among many others. The pies made in these molds were quite beautiful and were sure to impress guests at the dinner, supper, or special events such as balls or card games called routs at which they were served. Here is the pie I created to represent the one Mr. Bordley remembered so fondly. I'll now show you how I made it. In my version of Mr. Bordley's pie, I used Hannah Glass's recipe as my inspiration. The contents of typical raised pies consisted of layers of uncooked game, such as venison, duck, rabbit, hare, goose, or turkey. Beefsteak, ham, and bacon were also used. Sometimes balls of forcemeat, what we would call meatloaf, were placed in and around the layers. In addition, hard-boiled eggs and/or morel mushrooms were also added. You may be astonished at the amount of bacon in this pie, but game is very lean and can be quite dry. The bacon gives not just added flavor, but much needed added moisture. A lid is placed on top. The lid is sealed to the pie by crimping with a pie jagger. These pies were elaborately decorated. The mold forms the decorated sides, but it is up to the cook to decorate the top. I used period wooden paste molds to make these designs. After these pies were fully baked, melted clarified butter or warm gelatinous meat stock, also known as aspic, was poured through the hole on top. These pies were served cold, therefore the butter or stock solidified inside the pie. This added moisture, but also served to seal the contents from pathogens in the air. Before germ theory emerged in the 1860s, people did not know why this worked. Here's a cross-section of inside the pie showing the cooked layers. If the crust was going to be eaten, the pie was cut up in segments. If not, the top of the pie was lifted off and the contents were scooped out onto plates. Raised pies were important celebration foods in 18th and 19th century England and America, particularly for Christmas. A description of an excessively large pie shipped from Yorkshire to London in 1770 reveals it was 12 stone, or 168 pounds, 9 feet in circumference, and contained dozens of wildfowl, turkeys, and rabbits, and was considered to be a great curiosity. A good example of these pies' use in America comes from a 1786 letter from Colonel David Humphreys to George Washington, declining an invitation to Christmas. Humphreys was particularly desolate at not being able to, quote, have the felicity of eating Christmas pie at Mount Vernon. And Jane Austen also included these pies in her 1818 book Persuasion, in a scene whereby trestles and trays were bent under the weight of brawn and cold pies served at Christmas, contributing to the occasion being, quote, a fine family piece. Finally, it is clear that skill at making these pies was worth advertising. This ad from an 1807 London newspaper was placed by a middle-aged woman looking for a job as a cook. She notes in particular that she understands how to make raised pies. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history and making of raised pies inspired by Maryland's Way, the Hammond-Harwood House cookbook. Please visit my website for recipes and more information.